God, thanks for today. Thanks for this time to think about you and the arts, the way that we might encounter you through words and music, and especially today, visual art. Help us to open our minds and think of the times and places that we have encountered you through creativity, through passion, through an experience of otherness that we can experience through trying to engage with the creative products of others. Bless us as we leave here with open eyes, with open hearts. We can encounter you and the other people that we meet. Amen. All right, so if you don't have a Bible, feel free to grab one. There's a few up here. There's some more out on the outside. But we'll be reading a couple of verses from the New Testament, a couple of verses from the Old Testament. So if you don't have them, that's okay. You can look on your neighbor. But our topic for today is Incarnation and the Arts. Thank you so much. So Incarnation and the Arts. And we'll be focusing today on visual art, just because you can't talk about everything in the world. So we'll focus on just visual art for today, throughout the history of the world. I teach a semester-long class on basically the Bible and visual art, which I love, and so you'll see bits of that today. But this is just be a slight introduction to it. But we're going to start with the idea of words. We'll come back to this at the end of the hour, but this is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Everybody knows this is the transition from really the sort of pre-Reformed Catholic Church. We're celebrating the advent of Reformed theology, and a big part of that is a focus on the Word. And that rift doesn't begin with the Reformation. It begins even earlier, as we'll see in Old Testament thought. But one thing I'd like to start with us thinking about today is that words themselves are pictures. So words are pictures, right? So I've got my daughter is learning to write. Freddie, my son, already knows all the letters, but Margaret is just learning them right now, and it's reminding me that you have to actually teach people to draw little pictures. That's what words are. And when we make sounds, what we're doing is making little patterns of movements of air with our vocal cords, which is something like a little sound picture that repeats over and over again, just like words repeat. So the thing I'd like to start with is just pointing out that when we make art, when we make pictures, when we make signs, when we write something, when we say something, what we're doing is we're making little patterns that are symbolically referencing something else. So when I say Brennan, that's my name. It's a sound pattern that I can say over and over again, and you'll hear it, and the thing it'll do, hopefully, is it'll point back to me. It'll refer to something else. So when we talk about pictures and words and names and all these other things, we're talking about stuff, material stuff, that references not just another material entity, but oftentimes like an idea, something that's not just purely tangible. So Brendan isn't just me, just like my body. It's also all the stuff that makes me up, my personality, my history, what people think about me, my reputation or whatever. Like all those things are embodied in my name. And so whenever we say something, or whenever we write something, or whenever we draw something, I think this has to do with our class this semester, because what we're talking about is incarnation. You're taking an intangible thing and putting it in visible form, material form. So every word has a material side, the side that you either write or you say, and then it has this kind of, transcendent form too, like the thing that it refers to, like the concept. So, for example, if I say love, that's a word, there's a material part to that, the actual sounds that my mouth makes, the actual shapes that I draw on a page that make you then think of this intangible concept. As an artist friend that I have, Dayton Castleman, who lives in Arkansas, and he told me once, whenever you draw a line, that's an incarnation. You're taking an idea, an abstract idea, a line, and you're putting it into material form. And I thought that was a really neat way of thinking about how the arts are thinking in terms of incarnation already from the very beginning. And Dayton also pointed out something else, that whenever we speak, we're incarnating something. There's something intangible, ethereal that we're putting into words. And there's a famous author who, I forget, it's slipping my mind who said this exactly, but somebody said this once, that every use of words is a wager with transcendence. You're hoping that there's something beyond that your words can reference. that may or may not actually exist, but that you're just hoping that there can be some sort of communication that happens between you and another person. So this aspect of communication, of materiality and transcendence, for Christians, for time immemorial, this has been an interesting way for them to think about the incarnation, but also a site of tension, and as we'll see, a site of fighting, because whenever you start talking about exactly how things might incarnate in terms of words or pictures and so on, people start to get a little bit worried, especially when you're talking about God. So here's Rene Magritte's famous picture. Yes, Bruce?
Quick comment to add. I used to study this stuff in a previous incarnation. Man, it's a communal phenomenon also. The letter W represents the rule of sin because we agree that it makes that sin.
Yeah,
so it's a communal thing.
Right, and it's interesting because it's also not just individual. Like if I decide to say my own words and things, there's no language, there's no communication. It is bigger than ourselves, but also it is limited in time and space in terms of who can actually access this kind of communication. Yeah. So I think it'd be. I was thinking the other day it might be interesting to do like a few weeks, sometime in a class like this on language itself and just how language works. But anyway, so here's René Magritte's famous picture. "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." In French, this is not a pipe. And of course, it's a pipe, right? But Magritte's joke is that no, it's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. This is playing on a Western idea, mimesis, with the ancient Greek idea, which is that pictures are just representations of things; they're not the things themselves. But Magritte's kind of making a joke too, because that really is also a pipe, right? He's trying to show that this is a slippery ground. If you just try to say that's really not a pipe. Well, I mean, my goodness, like why is Magritte doing this then? Why do people make pictures of pipes? Or if I see a big picture of a pipe on a wall in a store, I probably know I could buy pipe tobacco there, right? I mean, so these things actually do function. It's not just a little word game from Magritte. But one thing I want to step back and say is that there's never been anything that's just a picture. That's never been true of anything. People say sticks and stones break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Of course they can. You've been hurt by them. You will hurt other people with them in the future. Like these things actually do hurt. Pictures hurt too. We might think, we're above and beyond these kind of ancient notions that like pictures are real things or something. But if someone takes a picture of you and like burns it in front of you, you might be like, that's unsettling and unhappy, and I don't like that, right? So there is something that pictures actually they are involved in who we are. They do actually affect the material world. And this tension, the pictures are real things. They actually do real things. And words also are real things that actually affect the material physical world. This can be seen even in the Old Testament. Now, many people believe when they kind of hear about ancient Judaism, ancient Israel, they imagine these are aniconic people. They've heard that Jews don't like images, therefore ancient Israelites don't like images. In fact, ancient Israelites love images. Images are everywhere. This is a little cutaway picture of the first temple as described in the book of 1 Kings, the Temple of Solomon. And we hear about pictures everywhere. There's pictures of cherubim, which are not little fat babies, but cherubim in the ancient Near East were lion bodies, human heads, and big winged creatures. They were supposed to signify kind of the world beyond the heavenly court. And then they had pictures of palm trees with pomegranates on them. There are pictures on the priest's vestments. There are pictures on the door of the temple. The columns outside the temple had pictures of, they were basically big palm trees and so on. There were pictures everywhere inside the temple. And in fact, there were pictures all over stuff that ancient Israel had. Ancient Israel didn't seem to be an aniconic, that is a non-picture liking people. They loved pictures. What they didn't seem to like, at least at some points in their trajectory, was pictures of their God, Yahweh. They seemed to be worried about the cult statue. So when you see in Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments, or in Exodus, the Ten Commandments, it'll say, you shouldn't have any other gods before me, and don't make any idols, right? Don't make any pictures of me. But that's pictures of me, but also don't make any pictures that you would worship of anything else. The Ten Commandments doesn't say never make pictures. It says don't make pictures of a god. So this is an interesting step, but the description of this, we think this is a historical kind of development in ancient Israelite religion. We think at first they did have statues of Yahweh, and eventually they thought, this isn't a good idea, we don't like it. But I want to read you a little bit of Deuteronomy 4. This is in honor of the Reformation here. This sounds a lot like a Reformed theologian, so like Martin Luther himself. But this is this is an ancient Israelite way of thinking about how God cannot be pictured. So if you have your Bibles, Deuteronomy 4, if you have green Bibles, page 125, and I'll start reading from verse 15. So this is taking part in the narrative, the level of the narrative. This is Moses speaking to the Israelites as they're about to occupy the promised land, and they are about to become sort of a people of all of themselves. And he's trying to remind them about their story. And so here he's talking about what happened at Sinai when all of the people of Israel saw God on Sinai. But verse 15, since you saw no form when the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire, so there's fire on top of the mountain and so on, but they didn't see any form, any actual picture. Verse 16, so that you do not act corruptly by making an idol for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that's on the earth, the likeness of any a winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps in the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. And when you look up to the heavens and see the sun, the moon, the stars, and the host of heaven, do not be led astray and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under heaven. For the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron smelter, out of Egypt, to become a people of his very possession as you are now. So the argument here is that God appeared to them like fire and not in any form that they could image. So what is fire like? It's hot. What? Moving. It's hot. It's moving. It's protein. Yeah, it's dangerous. You don't want to get too close to it. But also when you draw a picture of fire, you're only drawing like one piece of the picture. It's constantly moving. You can never quite capture it, right? And so this is saying that kind of God is bigger than any picture. You can't just put God into a picture. It's light. Yeah, it lets you see other things. The point isn't that you stare at the fire, it's that you make the fire so that other things come into visible light. I mean, it's all kind of here behind this idea. We call this a Deuteronomistic theology of God. Now, there are other ancient theologians in ancient Israel that would have disagreed with this and said, no, we like pictures of Yahweh. But this is the one that won out in the long run. If you turn with me real quick if you just kind of turn forward in your Bibles to 2 Kings, book of 2 Kings. If you're in the green Bibles, it's in the 260s. 2 Kings, let's get to Hezekiah 18. So 2 Kings chapter 18, and we'll start in verse 1. So if you want to know the truth of ancient Judah as according to the book of Kings, there were only two good kings, really, Hezekiah and Josiah. Both of them occur near the end of the reign of the kings of Judah that were descended from David. And this guy Hezekiah was really good because he broke these pictures of the gods that were inside the temple in Jerusalem. And that was his way of reforming and clearing out all this stuff. So, chapter 18, verse 1. In the third year of King Hoshea, son of Elah of Israel, Hezekiah, son of King Ahaz of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, daughter of Zechariah. The queen mother is always important to ancient Israelite authors. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, just as his ancestor David had done. He removed the high places, broke down the pillars, and cut down the sacred pole. This is the Asherah pole. Sometime we'll talk about the feminine sacred in Israel as well. He broke it in pieces, and he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. Do you remember a story about Moses with snakes? In the book of Numbers, Moses makes a bronze snake because the people are getting bitten by snakes, and he lifts it up, and the people look at it, and they're healed. It's like an apotropaic magic trick, Jesus references this when he's talking to Nicodemus in the book of John, for chapter 3. He says, remember Moses lifted up the bronze serpent? And Nicodemus says, yeah, I remember that. And Jesus says, that's me. It was a picture of the foreshadowing of me. But here we see that Hezekiah hated this thing. So apparently a long time ago, the Israelites put this big picture of a bronze serpent in the middle of their temple. And Hezekiah takes it out and breaks the thing into pieces because people have been worshiping it. So we can see here that there's a fight already over images and the role that they play within the community. What actually do these images show, and what power might they have? So this tension continues into early Judaism. There are Jews in the first few centuries that have synagogues that are painted from floor to ceiling, all over all four walls with images of all sorts of things from the Bible, but also from early rabbinical literature. There's early Jewish synagogues that have pictures of people with faces. They even image God in some ways. We can see over time there was a movement within the Jewish tradition that pushed against this, and now if you go to a synagogue, you'll see some pictures, but not of people. Sometimes of animals, but never of human faces. I shouldn't say never, but probably never of human faces. In the early Christian church, there was a fight too, a struggle over images. What's strange is that we have 0 pictures from early Christians until about the year 200. Now, part of this is that early Christians may have just been adopting other kinds of images, like the Good Shepherd image was an image really of the god Mercury, who carried a sheep, whatever, and like was the kind of messenger god. It's also nice to. Anyway, so this is a kind of image of a Greek, Greco-Roman god that was adapted to be Jesus. So when we find Good Shepherd images, are we looking at Jesus or are we looking at a Greco-Roman god? So they may have just been using vocabulary from images that were pretty common to people. But also, maybe they were aniconic in the early first few centuries. We're not really sure exactly. They don't talk a lot about images. If they do, it seems to be about things like pictures of a fish. Like early Christians drew pictures of fish to kind of signal to each other. But they don't seem to have drawn a whole lot of pictures of Jesus.
It's like Islam, too. They don't have their...
Right, Islam has the same exact sort of inner dispute about images. And you'll find certain times and places where Islamic literature is accompanied by pictures of people. So the Turks are a group of people who time and again have kind of said, it's okay to draw some pictures of people. And then there's usually a pushback. Iran is another place. The Iranian the Iranian Muslims have many times drawn like full pictures of people. And then there's kind of a pushback against that, and a lot of times these things get burned, but some of them make it out alive. So you'll find Islamic art, but then you'll also find a lot of Islamic art that's only calligraphy, only words, and so on. So anyway, this fight occurs in I think all of the major traditions that evolved out of ancient Israel. But early Christians, we think, by the 2nd, 3rd century, had started to make some images, even some pictures of Jesus, and so they started to think about why they were doing this. And again, there were fights about this. But a lot of patristic or early Christian theologians started to talk about why, okay, it's okay to image Jesus, it's okay to draw pictures of Jesus, precisely because our soul interacts with God, kind of, and it's almost like the way that our picture interacts with our soul through our eyes. Like it's a way for us to think about God, because something out there gets into us through our eyes, in the same way that something out there, like God, might get into our soul through interacting. So it's kind of a way that they start to think. And a lot of this is based on early Christian writings as well, the ways of thinking about Jesus. So if you turn with me to the New Testament, to Colossians chapter 1 of the letters it's assigned to Paul. Deutero-Pauline letter, probably. If you're in the green Bibles, it's on the New Testament, page 155. They start reading them green after the New Testament. I don't know why. As if it's two different books. Okay, so if you turn to the book of Colossians, near the end of the Bible, if you've gotten any John and so on, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, Revelation, you've gone too far, turn back. Colossians verse 15 is... Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 is one of the major texts that early Christians point to if people ask them, why are you drawing pictures? And it goes like this. This is talking about Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of creation, for in him all things in heaven and earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or powers or rulers, all things have been created through him and for him. And it's really that first part of that verse. He is the image of the invisible God. So can you all see maybe how early Christians start to look at this and they say, Jesus changed something. Maybe it's not okay to draw a picture of like God in heaven, but it's okay maybe to draw a picture of Jesus because he became a person. So if Jesus is a person, and Jesus' point is to be an image of God, then of course we're like, we have to make images of Jesus then, because Jesus made it okay to make images. Does that make sense? That kind of logic, right? So if Jesus is here to show us who God is, that means that Jesus is an image of God. If Jesus is an image of God, then it's our duty to make more images to show people about Jesus. And so some early Christians start to say, well, the Gospels themselves are pictures or images of Jesus, depictions of Jesus. Right? So metaphorically, that's okay. And so the point of Jesus is to get us to interact with God in some way through our eyes and through our ears and so on, through our senses. And so our soul is supposed to interact with God through some of these material things. They're prompts, really, to get us to interact with God, just like Jesus was. So that's a way that they start to justify. So by the year 300, we see tons of Christian art, a flourishing of Christian art. We can tell it's Christian art because they're depicting things that only Christians would depict, like Peter taking a stick and getting water from the rock or something in prison, which is an early Christian legend. Or Jesus on the cross, which is actually quite late to emerge in Christian art. But when we see someone hanging on a cross, we know it's probably Jesus. So Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus are two early Christian theologians who are very influential in the history of Christian art because they start to make the argument that most people can't read. In the early Christian church, people would there's a few people who have the ability to read, and they read out loud. They would read the whole Gospels and so on, and people would sit and listen to them. They say, well, not everyone has the chance to read or has the time to get someone else to help them read or hear aloud the Gospel, but we still want people to encounter the Gospel, so we can make big pictures and put them in our churches, so then people can walk in, and people who are illiterate can read those images. And that way be kind of reading Scripture, because pictures are easier to read than words, which I don't think is actually true. If you pull someone from a foreign culture and put them in like an image in like my, I draw a bunch of pictures that make sense to me, they might be like, I don't know what these are, I don't know what we're talking about, right? So pictures are part of the language in the same way that I think words are. But in any event, they had the idea that people would be able to just understand what they saw. But I also point out that in the early church there was also dissent. There was the Synod of Elvira. This is nothing to do with witches or whatever, but Elvira is a city in Spain, and they had a local group of bishops get together in 306 and say, it has been decreed that no pictures be had in churches, and that which is worshipped or adored be not painted on the walls. So in other words, you get kicked out of the church if you paint anything on your wall. Their larger argument is that Jews don't do this, the Jews in their area didn't do this, and that was an older practice, and so you were going against the Ten Commandments if you did it, so it's bad. So in any event, there was a fight. But as I said, almost everyone becomes a picture-oriented Christian by the time of the middle of the 4th century, by the time of the post-Constantine church. Here's an image from the early Christian church from the catacombs. As we all know now, the catacombs are not places that Christians ran away to hide during persecutions. They were just burial places. It was illegal to bury anyone within the area of the city of Rome for health reasons, for sanitary reasons. So just like in France, if you've ever been to Paris, to the catacombs there, people started to dig down outside of the city, underground places to just bury people. And in Rome, there's a lot of volcanic rock that you can kind of dig down. It's easy to dig into it, but once you dig it and it's exposed to air, then it hardens quite quickly. It's called tufa rock. So you can dig these catacombs really easily down there. So that was it wasn't a place to hide, it was a place to just to bury. And so the Christian burial places in the catacombs are sometimes next to non-Christian burial places, or pagan, we might call them burial places, or also next to Jewish burial places. So in other words, these were common spaces for lots of people to hang out and bury their dead, and also come back and celebrate their dead, almost like a Dia de los Muertos kind of situation in the Roman Empire, where you would gather with your loved ones and remember through a sacred meal those who have died. So this is an image of Jesus in the catacombs in Rome from about the year probably 330 or so. So this is just when Christianity is becoming kind of legal, and we see here on the very top of the sort of domed ceiling an image of Jesus, and you see Alpha and Omega, referring to Revelation, right, where Jesus is becoming sort of the revealed as the person who's at the beginning and the end of the universe. This image of Jesus didn't just emerge out of nowhere. So we're in a Greco-Roman culture. Those of you who have some background in Greco-Roman culture, who is Jesus being depicted as? Big dude with a beard. Zeus. Yeah, this is this isn't happenstance that Jesus looks like this. We'll get into this in the next few minutes, but there's a fight over what Jesus even looks like. How are you supposed to image Jesus? This is one image of Jesus. Zeus, who's like the heavenly Zeus, who's stars up above, like Jesus as Zeus. This makes sense in a Greco-Roman environment. Here's another image. This is from underneath St. Peter's. I don't know if you all know this. I don't have time to get into the whole explanation, but St. Peter's in Rome is actually built on top of an ancient city of the dead. It was an above-ground hill where people had these, really houses where they would have bury their dead relatives. And many of them were to Greco-Roman gods. There were a lot of Isis images there. That was a popular deity to be associated with funerary rites in the Roman Empire. So there's all these kind of pagan, we might call them gods and goddesses, that are on this path, that are being venerated, along with the imagery of the dead families. And then once you get kind of to a certain point in the hill, things turn Christian. And this is all underneath St. Peter's Church. So St. Peter's was built on a place where early Christians believed that Peter was actually buried. It was outside of Rome. It's to the west of the Tiber River, because you can't bury people inside the city. So that's why Vatican is on the other side of the river from Rome. But also, over time, after it was probably Constantine's son, took a bunch of fill and leveled out the hill where Peter supposedly had been buried, along with some other early Christians, and made a big flat bottom to sort of build a foundation of a church. That's where Old St. Peter's was built. And you could get down to that floor of Old St. Peter's Church if you're ever in New St. Peter's. It was built in the Renaissance era. Michelangelo was the architect of the dome and so on. So that's now the floor level when you walk in is the new floor level from the 16th century that was built on top of the 4th century Constantine era level that was built on top of this hill. If you're ever in Rome, apply in advance to go on the Scavi tour, which just means excavations. But the excavations underneath St. Peter's, only 15 or so English-speaking folks can go a day, so you got to apply in advance. But if you go down there, you'll see this, which there's a hole here because when they were building the new St. Peter's in the 16th century, they were digging these big foundations to go down into the ground, and they did not know that there was an ancient burial ground underneath there. Like they just thought that like Peter was buried under there, and that was it. So this guy breaks through this hole into a cavern and starts walking around and sees images of like Isis and underneath St. Peter's there's pictures of like Greco-Roman gods and goddesses. Like it was freaking these people out in the 16th century. And then this guy sees this, and he interprets this as Sol Invictus, which it looks like, the god of the Roman army, the invincible sun god, which was the major god of the Roman army. And so he freaks out. They pull him up there, and they swear this guy's screaming. They make him swear to not tell anyone like what was underneath there. So they fill up this area, and they basically seal it off. And one priest writes about it, and basically they seal the documents. They swear everyone to secrecy, and people actually keep it a secret until World War II, when the Vatican was trying to build some gardens in the 1940s, and ended up like accidentally like poking into part of the City of the Dead. And when they did that, they discovered some of the stuff, and then began some secret, because of the fascist occupation, some secret excavations, and discovered this whole little realm. So you can go see like what the early Christians claimed was Peter's burial ground and so on, the tomb underneath there. But also see this, which is one of the earliest pictures we got in Rome of Jesus. So this is probably the era before Constantine. This is in the, 250s or something. And we think it's Jesus because it looks like Sol Invictus, the sun god, with his chariot and so on, but also because it's arrayed in sort of a cross, the light that's coming out of his head. But also, what the guy didn't see when he was down there in the 16th century was on the other side of the panel, there's clearly Jesus pulling Peter out of the water. Jesus, the boat, Jesus is walking on the water, Peter's in the water, Jesus is pulling him out. And there's also Peter fishing, which are things that aren't in the Sol Invictus vocabulary of images. So anyway, this is an early picture of Jesus being pictured as the invincible sun god, Sol Invictus. So we know that the Greco-Roman Christians, at least, and we assume everyone was doing this, were trying to use visual imagery, sort of iconic vocabulary from other traditions that they were interested in, to try to explain different parts of Jesus. Jesus is like the invincible sun god. He can't be beaten. He rises every morning and so on. He seems to die and comes back like the sun. So things like that. Here is Santa Costanza. This is Constantine's niece's church where she was buried, and she designed it. So Constantine the Great, his niece, designed this area, and this is some of the earliest Christian imagery we have that's extant in Rome. And here we have Peter and Paul talking to Jesus. And take a look at Jesus here. He doesn't look like Zeus. So he looks like a young, shaven god, and a kind of eternal youth god, which is how Sol Invictus was often depicted. And on an axe mosaic that's just opposite this. So you can like walk easily from one side to the other, and these are built at the same time by the same architects and same artists. Here's another image of Jesus receiving from a martyr. We're receiving praise from a martyr. And here Jesus is enthroned like on the earth. And we know this is Jesus, it's a Christian apse. I don't know who else this would be. But notice that this is Jesus on one side of the apse, and there's Jesus on the other side of the apse, and they're imaged differently. And this looks like maybe a Zeus image of Jesus. Big giant dude sitting enthroned with a big beard. Here's an image of Zeus, also from Rome about the same time. Here's an image of Sol Invictus, also from Rome at about the same time. And notice that Jesus is being imaged in multiple ways at the same time. So one thing we can see for the early Christians is that they don't actually think that they're depicting what Jesus the Nazarene looked like. They're trying to give us ideas about what Jesus means, using the images that were familiar to them. Now there is a point in time, there is a point in time at which some of the Romans, or at least they would have called themselves Romans, you might call them Byzantines, folks who continue the Roman tradition, the eastern half of the empire after the West falls, begin to think a little bit more carefully about, like, wait, what, are we depicting the real Jesus or not? Like, how do these images, are we trying to depict Jesus? If Jesus is the image of the invisible God, does the actual face of Jesus matter? In other words, should we just use Zeus and Sol Invictus, or should we try to figure out, like, hey, what do people like who come from Nazareth look like? What do Galileans look like? Well, so this is a coin from Justinian II, the son of Justinian I. This is one of the major emperors of the early Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Romans. Right, it's in the 7th century, in the year 670 or so. So here's his early image of Jesus. Notice Jesus has a beard, he's got long hair, he's got kind of the Zeus image that they've inherited. Also by this time, he's looking a lot like, kind of shaggy monk. And then Justinian II goes on a trip to the Holy Land and meets people who live in, say, Galilee. And he says, they don't have long, shaggy, straight hair and big, shaggy, long beards. They don't look like that. So he comes into contact with people who look like this. And so he makes these coins. This is the actual coin that he would have used in Justinian II's empire. And then he comes back and he makes new coins. Tries to call the old coins out of circulation because they don't have the right picture. So here's that first picture, his earlier coin, and then his later coin that he re-releases. He says people from Nazareth have curly hair, they have darker hair, they have short curly beards, not these long kind of like scraggly beards, right? So this is the new image of Jesus. And yeah, question.
Well, is part of this struggling with the crucifixion? I remember you saying last week that there was this struggle about how to depict someone who was crucified, and whether that was like a source of shame or is part of that, sort of that, like not knowing what to do with that, and so turning to these other images.
It might be a part of that, yeah. And by this time, the Byzantine Empire was starting to depict crucifixion a little bit more, but it's still not common. So this is in the 600s. They start to depict crucifixion in the 400s about, but even those early ones are just pictures of Jesus like toughing it out, like being strong, breaking the cross, whatever. It's more recent modern innovation there, especially like the strong Jesus, he's not a wimp. But they're still not depicting the crucifixion in a kind of a gory, sad way. That actually evolves in the Middle Ages, really with Francis of Assisi around then. You start to get veneration of the broken Christ. So the strength of Christ, but also I think the thing that's really behind this is this Greek idea of mimesis. Like, if we want to access Jesus, we have to have the right picture of Jesus. Because if you have the wrong picture of Jesus, then like you're accessing Zeus or like whatever. And this brings me to my kind of bigger point, is that every time you see images that have to do with religion, they all have either an implicit or explicit. Some people are clear about this, some people don't really talk about it. But everyone's got rules about what's actually happening with the image. How is the image interacting with the world beyond? So we can see here that Justinian II he's thinking about the rules, and he's thinking, we want actual pictures. We want the real Jesus. And so you have to have the, like if I show you a picture of like somebody else and I say, this is me, you might say that's not you, it's not real, or whatever. If I send a picture to someone and say, hey, think of me when you look at this, and it's a picture of like some dude, random guy, they might be like, this doesn't help me, I don't see the connection here, right? So that's the way that Justinian II was thinking, and that his the rules of Eastern Christian veneration of images, you've heard them referred to as icons, is that there is a real prototype image out there. And like you have to have something that looks like it in order to have this resemblance. Now Justinian actually did himself some kind of anthropology and went and looked at real people. Unfortunately, his innovation to actually think about what actual people in the Middle East look like didn't follow through. Pretty quick, they went back to pictures of sort of Western-looking Jesuses, even in the Eastern Orthodox Church. They're Western European people. So they go back to this model and kind of retain that for the rest of the Byzantine Empire. But I love this as a little intervention of kind of reality into the game. But for Eastern Christians, that is for Christians in Syria, Christians in Assyria, the Assyrian Orthodox Church, which is in basically Iraq today, Christians in Iran. Those folks generally do have pictures of Christ, until now, that of Christ with short curly hair, black hair, and a short curly black beard. And generally with skin that we wouldn't depict as like kind of, Norwegian or something. So this all goes along with this kind of development of image theory. So every image has an image theory, either explicit or implicit. And this guy named Hypatius, an Eastern theologian, writing in 535 CE, says, "We allow material adornment in the sanctuaries because we think that some people are guided even by these images towards intelligible beauty, and from the abundant light in the sanctuaries to the unintelligible and immaterial light." So in other words, it's a guide, it leads you, takes you somewhere else. So people might have asked, why do we have like gold in the churches when we could be using it to feed people? And they say, well, it's a good thing to feed people, but also we want to be able to lead people on a spiritual journey that will transform these individuals, that will lead them to do these good things once they leave. In other words, it's an idea that like the transformative experience of being in a worship space also involves being led out and above and beyond this space. If you've ever been in an Eastern Orthodox church, the whole point of it, of the church service, is they're trying to like enact what heaven is kind of like. Which might not be your kind of heaven. It's standing for 3 hours in an incense-filled room, which I actually like, but most people don't. But you might be thinking, hey, I've been to Eastern Orthodox churches, or I've been to the Greek festival. I've been in there up on Claremont. Like I've been in that sanctuary. Like, and those pictures don't look very real, right? They actually look kind of flat, like this over here on the left. Right? This, you're right. This image, like they look kind of unreal. Like I know real. Like this is a realistic sculpture, or at least real-like, or whatever. Kind of, the Greco-Romans had these like realistic sculptures, and then we moved to this kind of flat, like unrealistic imagery. The Byzantines and the early Roman Christians, they know that there's good art out there. Good art is in the sense that it's mimetic; it's trying to depict a real person. That sculpture on your left there is Aphrodite of Cnidos by Praxiteles, an ancient Greek sculptor who was then kind of recast and repeated in the Roman Empire a whole bunch. As an example of like the thing that came alive. The legends were that this statue like came alive. It was a cult statue, right? So this Aphrodite will come alive and actually do things and bless people and help them or hurt them and so on, and then go back to her statue form. But so you might think then, okay, so if early Christians are in a culture where reality, like real close reality, is related to cult statues, and cult statues like kind of coming alive and like doing good or doing harm. Early Christians actually had this kind of retro version to like a flat kind of art. They knew how to do this, but they chose not to. They chose to make kind of clunky images of like flat images where the feet get splayed out, kind of like Egyptian art, where there's a reduction in perspective and so on, precisely because they didn't want you to think that it was a cult image, right? So they're still thinking about that Deuteronomy passage, right? Don't make idols. So that's why Christians don't have sculptures in their churches for a long, long time until the Renaissance. They'll have like sculptures on walls, like bas-reliefs, but they won't have like in the round statues because they don't want you to think it's a cult statue. There's a big fight over this in the early Christian church. So the Eastern Orthodox folks, they say, okay, we want to be clear that what we're making are just images, but also we want those things to be connected to the world beyond. It's a tension that pervades. And that tension came up and created actual conflict and actual wars. Right? There's the wars of the iconoclasts. So there are two groups of people in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Every Eastern Orthodox church, if you're a kid and grew up in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, like you have to learn about all this stuff. Like there's the iconodules, people who serve images and love images, and the iconoclasts, people who break images. And this was an actual fight in the Eastern Church. This is a guy named John the Grammarian. He loves words. He likes words more than images, so he was called John the Grammarian. And here's an image of him in what's called a Kludov Psalter, a psalter that was a book of Psalms that was illustrated, that was made after the fights between the image people and the non-image people. If you've been in an Eastern Orthodox church, you know who won. The image people, because there's images all over those churches. But these folks said there should be no images in churches at all. And in fact, the first version of the Hagia Sophia that was built now in Istanbul, it was in Constantinople, had very few images in it. So if you go there, you can actually see remnants of this today. We'll talk about that in a minute. But here he is with a big stick. He's whitewashing an icon. So they whitewash the icons in order to kind of cover them over and get rid of them. Here's the Kludov Psalter's way of understanding this. Here's John the Grammarian down here whitewashing an image, but he's being depicted as the analog or metaphor for Stephanon and Longinus, the two soldiers in Christian tradition who offer him the vinegar-soaked kind of ball, and also the guy who pokes him in the side with the lance. So this is like bad, right? He's hurting Jesus by covering up images of Jesus. So if you go to an Eastern Orthodox church and you see the images that are on the walls or on the ceilings, on the domes and so on, idea behind that is that that's actually Jesus or Mary or God the Father. Like those are real. It's really God is being depicted, or the saints, and they have like almost like a portal through which that they can encounter you. It's like a teleportation device or something, you know, but it's like limited in time and space. So you can stand and actually engage with the person behind that image. So that thing is just an image, but it's an image that like transports you and allows you to. So when priests in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, this is different times and places, but for a long time at least, almost all of them had to stand in front of an image of Jesus and be judged for like hours, and then come away and say, "What did you like? Should you be a priest or not? Like, did Jesus tell you? Should you, did you pass or not? And the person had to say like whether or not they passed. But the whole idea is that you were actually engaging with the world beyond through the image. So we can see this is evidence of the iconoclasts. This is a church that's in Istanbul today, and it's within the compound for the palace in Istanbul, the later Ottoman palace. So if you're ever there, you'll kind of see it's the Church of St. Irene. But you can see there's just a cross. That's it. That's the only thing you can make a picture of. And the Hagia Sophia was actually like this for a long time. I'm going to skip this. This is a long passage by John of Damascus. John of Damascus is super important for Christian tradition because he's the guy who wrote the big long treatise that explained how it's orthodox or okay to have images. And he's the one who gave the intellectual sort of support to defeat iconoclasm. If he hadn't wrote all these many books on divine images, it's very possible that the iconoclasts would have won. And by the way, when this is happening, this exact same time, 6th, 7th, 8th century, this is when Islam is starting to rise, and Islam is interpreted as a religion that has destroyed their images, and for the Eastern Orthodox folks, they're having success, military success, because they got rid of images. So they're not idol worshippers, so God is giving them success, and they're interpreted as like a version of Christianity for actually many centuries by Eastern Orthodox. The Byzantine Empire doesn't really understand who they are or what they believe. They think they're like non-image worshiping Christians. But John of Damascus writes back and says, no, let's preserve the images. God's going to get mad at us if we don't have them. So they have this internal dispute, and there's an actual victory. It seems to have been, there are actually two different kind of wars of iconoclasm. Both of them seem to have been won by women leaders in the church who were devoted to images. So the women seem to be the ones who are mainly the image supporters. The men who were in charge of the military seem to be the ones that had most interest in reducing image worship. I don't know exactly, there's not a clear answer as to why that is. But you can see this is the Hagia Sophia today, or the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It was turned into a mosque when when Constantinople fell, it was turned into Istanbul. And so you can see images of Muslim art, Islamic art, which are pieces of the first surah of the Quran, rendered in calligraphy. But then also you can see there some of the Byzantine images as well that survive today. And one of those images is here on the main apse mosaic. And this was the first big image dedicated after the wars of the iconoclasts and the iconodules of the servants of the images won. You can see this image here. It's of Mary and Jesus. Again, the idea being incarnation itself is the thing that gives us like the fact that Jesus was a person with flesh and body and bones, born from Mary, a real person, and then shown to the world. She presents him to the world. That this is the thing that gives us the ability to make images, and this makes them okay. We get all these really fascinating traditions of images that follow. I'll just give you a few insights into this, and then I'll move into the Reformation to close. But there are all these really weird stories, and you probably heard these, of like Jesus touching things with his face and making like relics, kind of like they call them touch relics. You've heard of one probably called the Veronica. So the Veronica's veil. So there's a woman named Veronica that supposedly this is part of the Stations of the Cross that she, like when Jesus is bleeding, carrying the cross to Jerusalem. This is not in the Bible, but it's in Christian tradition. She gives him a kind of a cloth to blot his face to keep the blood down. So he blots his face and makes an impression of his face. He gives it to her, and it's like this miraculous image of his face that's created. And so then he gives it back to her, and she has this relic of Jesus' face. What did he really look like? The true image of Christ. And if you think about the name Veronica, it's actually a conflation of two Latin words, vera, icona, the true image. Right? So again, this is like the whole idea that she's the one, Veronica has the true image of Jesus. Well, this image is really, the story is very old, in fact. It goes back to the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. And the stories don't involve Veronica at first. She's a Western Christian, like a Roman Christian innovation, to kind of take the story a bit for themselves. But it starts out that there was, the story is that there's a king of the Armenians in the 4th century or 3rd century, where it's kind of hard to tell when the story originates. But the story is that he wanted a picture of Jesus. So he writes a letter to Jesus when Jesus is alive. And says, I've heard of you. You seem like a cool guy. His name is King Adgar of Edessa. So King Adgar V was what he apparently was called. So he says, please send me a picture of you, and then I'll believe in you, whatever. And Jesus takes a cloth, he pushes his face on it, makes an image of himself, and sends it to King Adgar of Edessa. And it heals him of some sort of sickness, and so this becomes a true image. There's other stories that emerge after that in the following centuries that like that image was placed on top of a brick at some point, and then they pulled that off, and guess what? Like the holy image had like replicated itself on this brick, like a ceramic thing. So this was called the keramion. So these 2 images were understood in the East by the 2 different names, the mandylion and the keramion. So here's the mandylion, which is this image with the like fabric, right? And then here's the keramion, the ceramic image. And here's like the true face of Jesus. Now somebody has scratched these out. Some iconoclast at some point has thought these things were gross and scratched them out. But the whole point is that between these 2 images, these images are like really kind of depicting something beyond. And you can actually see there's kind of a little face there in between them in the sky beyond. It's been damaged a bit. But anyway, this idea is like these things are directing you to what's beyond it and behind it. And they're true images because they weren't made with human hands. This tradition of not being made with human hands, or archairopita, these are archairopita, things made without human hands in Greek, are referenced like in the early Christian traditions a whole lot, and these are become some of the major icons of Christian tradition. Excuse me. In the Constantinople, ends up the Byzantine Church ends up seizing some of these images from like the controls and bringing them to Constantinople to defend themselves against Muslim invasions. And they apparently march around the walls of Constantinople with these images and have some major victories, and so they think these things are, absolutely amazing. So Western Christians find out about this, and they say, we want to copy this too, these powerful images, right? So these are images, both Italian images. One of them's from Genoa, and one on the right, this is Genoa and the Holy Face of San Silvestro. These are said to be kind of impressions of the mandylion, like somebody took a cloth over there, put it on top, it made the image, and so on. The story of Veronica comes from this, the true image of Christ. And if you go to St. Peter's today, you can actually see the Veronica. It's hard to see what it is, but it's this, this is like the best image I can get of it. It's like way up high on this little altar, stuck in a recess above one of the pillars of St. Peter's. And they bring it out once a year and show it off, and then bring it back on the Feast of Veronica. I have a friend, an art historian, who went and looked at this thing. It's a cloth. It really is a cloth. It's like put in this bejeweled case. And he got to look at it, and he says it just kind of looks like a splotch of turpentine or something. It doesn't look like much that's behind it. But nonetheless, for centuries, has been said to be an accurate image of Christ. There's another tradition. If you are a painter, if you're an artist of any kind, your patron saint in the Catholic tradition is St. Luke. And it's because St. Luke was said to be, by early Christians, a painter. And he was said to have sat down and actually painted a portrait of Jesus and Mary. Which doesn't make any sense because the Gospel of Luke starts with him saying, I don't really know this guy, I'm just getting some stories about him and collecting them and so on, but whatever. So early Christians say that St. Luke sits down and paints this portrait of Mary, but can't finish it. He can't, there's something about them he can't capture in his portrait. So an angel comes and finishes it for him, and it becomes this holy image. This is called the Hagigatria. And if you're ever in an Eastern Orthodox church, or in a Catholic church, because they've adopted this tradition too, you'll see this image of Mary holding Jesus and kind of pointing to him. You saw this in the Hagia Sophia and the apse mosaic. These are important images because they're said to be kind of based on this true image of Mary that Luke made, and Jesus that Luke made. You'll see it in the apse mosaics of many churches in Eastern and Western traditions. And it was so understood to be so powerful in the West that when Venice kind of destroyed and sacked a lot of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade. By the way, the Fourth Crusade in 1215 was the crusade where they decided to go to the Holy Land, and they were like, no, Constantinople is so much better. And they stopped there and just burned to the ground, steal everything, make it a Latin Empire. Good job, guys. So anyway, this was a lot of the stuff you see in Venice was stolen from Constantinople in 1215 and made Venice a powerful place. But this is at St. Mark's today. It's called the Nicopoeia. It was stolen from Constantinople probably sometime around 1215. But it probably dates to about the 900s and sometime. But it was said to be kind of a real copy of St. Luke's portrait. So this continues into the Renaissance as a way for artists to say it's okay for us to make images of Jesus. You can see, and if you go to Rome, you can see that the Western tradition just steals this in many ways. This is called the Euronica, kind of like Veronica. But this is said to be a true image of Jesus that was taken from one of these sort of impressions of Christ. The Pope, once a year, this is in the Sancta Sanctorum, which is this area where like kind of the best stuff from the Pope is held in St. John's Lateran, which is a church in Rome where the Pope actually is the priest of St. John Lateran. But once a year he'll like open up the doors and like wash the feet of the statue. This image. It's a fascinating story of the Euronica. I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but this. If you go visit Rome, visit St. John Lateran, go across the street to the Sancta Sanctorum, and here's where all like the major treasures of the Pope are held. And you can see them for a slight fee. In any event, this, I'm going to skip ahead a few slides and just end with this. So the idea that images are powerful conduits to God finds a way into the Western tradition. So here's an Anglican, or really, English Catholic, late medieval image of what meditation is supposed to look like. So here is a nun in a convent who's getting blessed by a priest and probably confessing in some ways. She's told to go look at an image, an altar of Jesus and Mary, and she's praying to it. But then she has as she's praying like at an altar, she has a vision of Christ, and she can see Christ. So here's that same altar that she's looking at, but the picture kind of vanishes. This becomes the Western Christian tradition that it's not a gateway to God, but it's like a promise that leads you like kind of beyond up into the spiritual realm. The images don't do anything except for just start you on a voyage to meet with God. So the Western Christians are a little bit more reserved about this. The same idea leads to, here's a little close-up of the nun who is praying at an altar and then having a vision of God there. So Bruno of Senyi, one of the early Christian theologians or medieval Christian theologians from the West, who establishes this idea. He says, through gold ornament or pictures, the whole church rises up into a state of contemplation, and you are lifted out of the earthly realm into heaven. So you're able to participate. And I think this is what leads Western Christians to something like the Renaissance, with perspective. That you actually are seeing in some way the world beyond. This is the first linear perspective image painted in a church in the Western Christian tradition, Masaccio's Holy Trinity. And when people saw it, they started to cry because it was so lifelike, because it was depicted with actual perspective and scale, this kind of innovation. I don't have time to go into this, but you know, the Sistine Chapel, this is a great idea of like the transition that happens in the Renaissance, where we move away from just the idea that you're going to like just see these pictures and be lifted up to the heavenly sphere. Instead, this is an image of brain. This is an image of the human brain, right?
Yeah.
Here's the brain slide. Yeah. So this is God is imaged through human creativity. This is Michelangelo's whole point of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Like, we are the creators. God has given us the creative spirit. We make stuff with our brains, and then we flesh it out in real life. And that's how God is imaged in the world, is through our creative acts. So this transition that we can see is a very different way of thinking about how art functions in the church, right? Also, the Sistine Chapel was scandalous at the time because a lot of the Pope at the time, but also a lot of the Pope's friends did not understand this new way of thinking, right? They thought that they were supposed to look and kind of be lifted up to the beyond. Michelangelo instead says we're supposed to look at art, and it's supposed to let us know about the human creative potential and human spirit, and that is the way that we actually come to meet God, through human creativity. This leads into the Reformation. Here's a picture of Martin Luther, this guy who starts to think about like human creativity, human thinking, but also thinks less in terms of like the human creative spirit of making like heroic nudes, and he starts to think more about human thinking in terms of the word. And so through Martin Luther, there's a shift back towards thinking of human creativity in terms of preaching and talking instead of creating art. And so this is the result of the Reformation. We have this kind of rift again that opens up in Christian tradition between the word and the image. So my thing I'd like to leave you with today is just the idea that maybe these things aren't as different as we think sometimes, but maybe there's many different ways that we can think about the way that images can depict God and can lead us to God. So, thanks.
Thank you.